Well, one of the most rewarding areas of Football Manager is often youth development. The chance to bring through a young player, mould them into a first team star, or as we've noticed increasingly in real life trends in recent seasons, sell them for a massive profit to the club. Either way, you've got to hone your skills when it comes to developing youth players because there are so many steps along the way where you can trip up, you can stop your players' development, and sometimes even send them backwards. So today, I'm going to take you through what has essentially become my unintentional 5-step guide to developing youth players in Football Manager. Perfect if you're managing in a one club story or a builder nation and you need to maximize what you get from youth talent. And we'll also adapt it along the way with tips for if you're managing a club that has a lower reputation in a lower league pyramid, or maybe someone who's right at the top. And that's the example I'm going to show you on this occasion. So I don't often do that on a channel. So if you're looking forward to this one, please do put a thumbs up on the video. The long-term stories are both up in the eye above if you've missed them. But for now, let's get to our youth development guide. And we're going to try and go as close as possible to chronological order. Of course, no youth players are the same and you may get slight differences along the way with each. But generally, this is the sort of thought process I take when I'm going through developing a young player. So let's start with the first stage of a player's development, which is what you do when a player either arrives at the club if you've signed a player very young, or if a player comes through your youth intake, because in both situations, you still want to develop them into a star. So let's head over to Football Manager 2024 and take you through the process that I go through. Okay then, you can see that I've come to arguably the best side at the moment in club football because I wanted to make this an easy point to explain and not people worrying about certain players and people you haven't heard of. So we've come to Manchester City. I think you can probably establish already which players I might use as an example. But I guess in addition to when players are joining a club and when you're getting players through youth development, the other time you have to judge them is when you first join a club too. So this probably still applies. But lots of people overthink things when a player comes through their academy or they sign a new youngster and think that they have to do everything at once. But in truth, that just isn't what happens because when you've got a player who's very young and in the early stages of their development, you don't want to specialize them into a certain role because realistically, you've seen thousands of examples, and I'm not going to bore you to death, of players that start in one position and end up in another, because their attributes develop differently as they get older, as they mature, as their body grows, etc. I mean, let's just use one very famous example, Declan Rice, who started as a centre-half in the youth team and is now a centre midfielder for England and Arsenal. There's an example of one. There's also a very good example developing at Manchester City at the moment. So that's the reason I've picked them for this episode. Let's go and get to the development centre and Rico Lewis, who has just moved into the under-21s in this game. And he starts it as a development player with a right back as his natural position, who can also play right wing back, left back, centre midfield and holding midfield. Now, as you've seen with him in real life at the moment, if you watch the Premier League, and as you would probably expect from his positions in Football Manager, he's a pretty versatile young player who has featured in a number of different positions for his club. Now, the reason this is important is that it evidences the point that at 18, he is not a player who is being trained as a specialist right back. He is not a player who's being trained as a specialist centre midfielder. He is a player who is being developed generally and being played in the best position for him and for the team at a time. So let's take that back then to when you've got your first step of development with a young player. Let's say you get your own version of Rico Lewis through your youth academy intake this year, or maybe you sign one, a 17-year-old at the end of their contract, and you think he's going to be a star for the future. You do not want to go straight away and say, I'm going to go to his development, I'm going to train him as a right back, I'm going to make sure he's crossing slightly better because that might be his weakness for that position at the minute. I'm going to make sure it's ultra intense so he develops them quickly. And I'm going to chuck him straight into the first team squad, but I'm only going to play him if he can feature at right back because that's the only position I want him to be. That's not realistically how youth development works. And in years gone by in FM, it has been a bit rigid at times. But now we've got the flexibility to change that. So my initial tip when it comes to a player initially coming through, initially coming into the club as a signing when a very young player, is don't focus on specialities. Focus purely on individual training for any extreme weaknesses in the game, but nothing beyond that. Otherwise, just let them generally develop. If they've got something that's going to hold them back massively, then of course work on it. if you've got a player who's generally an attacking player, plays in maybe all of the front four positions, but their finishing's four, obviously you want to develop that because that is a huge weakness that is going to stop them ever reaching their potential. For Rico Lewis, looking at defensive-minded midfielders, centre mids, even a right back, there aren't really any extreme weaknesses in his game. So in this instance, just let the player develop. And then if you notice that a year or two down the line, his attributes are actually better suited to being a winger or to being a natural centre midfielder, then we can change the focus later down the line because you've got so many years of development for these young players. So in the early couple of years, probably from 16 when they come through, all the way up to perhaps 18 years of age like now, you just want to leave them developing unless they've got a huge weakness in their game. Then of course, let's say his crossing was 4 and we really needed to improve it. Well, then we'll go through and we'll have a look at the individual training and we'll just put an additional focus in on that. I'm not doing anything with the position and duty because I've not set his specifics in stone yet. I'm just saying you have got a real weakness when it comes to crossing the ball. We're going to do that. Now, in this case, I will set the reminder again. This is not the case, but I'm just showing you as an example. If that had been 4 or his technique had been a huge weakness, that could be an important stage early on. So with that out the way, on reflection, my big tip for the first part, the first year or two of a player's development is don't specialise training. Don't train them for a particular role or duty because as they develop, you're going to completely change your mind in some cases about where a player is best suited to play. And that might even be position rather than just role. In most cases, of course, it will just be a change of role within a position. But you don't want to specialise them too early because you're actually restricting their development to certain areas, which may get less out of the player in the long term. But let's move on to my second part of development, which is what we do when players start to show signs of promise. And I think from this point on, we can probably use Rico Lewis as our example. So the big decision you've got when you get to this stage is whether you promote a player into the first team, whether they're going to have enough time to get minutes, and whether they're going to be able to train at that level. And of course, if you don't, you end up then taking a number of backward steps and having to manage the player quite carefully by making them available for youth squads, by making them available for youth teams. But if they're stepped up to the first team too soon and they can't cope with the training and the intensity there, you can actually harm their development and certainly not their confidence and motivation. In which case you may see poor training development instead of good ones. So how do we best, when a player is showing signs of promise, develop them into a first team player without just throwing them into first team training and first team matches? Well, this is where my number 2 tip comes in. Let's go back to Football Manager and let's head over to Rico Lewis because he's a great example for this. So what you'll often see in real life, and it is something that is possible in FM, but is probably the most criminally underused feature in the whole game, is training units. Now, this is the sort of thing you hear a lot of in the media. Players that have been given an opportunity to train with the first team. You hear it with England duty quite a lot. Levi Colwill was an example in the summer. He was in the 21 squad, but we brought him over to train with the first team. He did well, played well in the Premier League, got into the next squad. There's another example. So what we want to do when players are showing signs of promise is give them an opportunity, show they're ready to come into the first team mix, but without throwing them into the first team and risking a huge halt in their development or lots of stoppages and problems along the way. So most people will naturally go here, they will promote a player to the first team, and then they'll just monitor their training, probably make them available for the youth setup, probably make them available for development games, etc. But that's a lot of work, and it's also not the most realistic way from real life. Let's look at the way that is. We go over to training and we go over to training units. We have got the most underused screen in Football Manager. This screen allows you to promote any reserve or youth team player into the first team training setup for as long or as little amount of time as you want. And I don't understand why people don't use it more. I spend a long time using this screen. For me, when I've got those players, probably are more obvious at lower levels, where you've got those players where you think, they might be ready to step up. They might be ready to help. But of course, at lower levels, you've got less certainty with strong personalities and things like that. So it's always a bit tougher to judge. Well, in those instances, all you need to do is come to this screen, training units, add or remove reserve or youth team players to first team training. Pick your player, pick your unit. So we're going to go to the 21s and the defensive unit, and we're going to pick Rico Lewis. Now, from that one click of a button there, Rico Lewis is still in the under 21 squad. He will still train with the 21s. He will still play for the 21s. He's still in the leadership groups for the 21s. And he's still with his social groups and his mates there. However, he is now getting a chance to train in the first team. So when we do any training session that involves defensive units, Rico Lewis will now be training with the likes of Gavardio and Walker and Stones and Ake and Ruben Diaz. But what he isn't is in the first team squad. So this means he'll still naturally play all the development games automatically, he'll be involved for selection, and he's still going to get all of that social development that he would have had before. But now you've got him the opportunity to train with a first team. And what you want to do at this stage is keep an eye on his training rating. So if he's training with the defensive unit in the first team 3 or 4 times a week, and his training rating goes up or stays at a very high level, then you might want to think, okay, this player might be ready for the first team. It's also a great way, even if you've got a player who you don't think is going to make it, but is training really well and showing a good attitude for the youth team, to reward them and see if they can step up. Because even if they can improve a bit, but not enough for you, it does mean you've got the option to then sell them on and make a profit on an academy player, particularly at the upper ends of the game. Something we see in real life a lot is something you can also use when you've got an injury crisis. And most importantly, when you've got to the other stage of the game, which is training rest, because later in the year, you've got a lot of fatigue, you've got 3 or 4 games a week, and you have got injuries, you've got to look after players. It can be a great way to fill out the training squad so you can still do full sessions and you can still get the most out of training. So for me, it's one of the most criminally underused screens. It's actually probably the most realistic part of training in FM and certainly the most realistic part of youth development. And from this stage, you can judge whether a player is ready to sink or swim and become a first team squad player permanently, or maybe go back and just spend a little bit longer developing in the under 21s. With that done, let's move on to stage 3, because this is sort of our first decision time. And it does sort of add on to our 5 at the end again. We'll mention why later because of recent real world developments. But part 3 is decision time, because once your player has showed some signs of promise and you've had them at first team level in the training units that we just looked at, you'll be deciding whether it's time for them to step up to the first team, whether it's time for them to stay in the 21s, but you're still happy they've got promise, or whether maybe they're not going to be good enough, because that will kind of change how you focus their development in steps 4 and 5. So the big part of step 3 is actually stepping back and making an important decision, and a decision that's going to affect this player's training development. This is the stage where you've got to make your initial decision, and you will get one more chance later on, so you've not got to worry if you've got a late bloomer or someone who's going to develop a different way. But at this stage, normally a couple of years in, at sort of 18 or 19, this is where we've got to make a real decision on how we're going to get this player to their maximum and what we're going to do with them to maximise value for the club or their worth to the first team in future seasons. So it's quite a big decision at the halfway stage where you're essentially deciding, am I actively going to train this player to become a first team player for me, or am I actively going to train this player just to become a professional footballer? That's the decision you're making in part 3. Once you've done that, you can move on to the final 2 steps, which are developing the player for specifics, either for your first team, for a professional footballer, and if it's for your first team, you're going to have to do a bit more work here. Let's go over to Football Manager and look at tip 4, which is the specifics. Now, the details of this step probably only need to be applied to the players who you are either certain or you think it is still possible could make it at your club as a senior player, because this is where you start shaping a player into one of yours. It's also worth doing for players that have got a potential high value or who could be a very good player but maybe not for your team and your tactical setup. So the specifics involve training your player very much in the opposite to what we mentioned in step 1, into a player ready to fit into a team. Is it going to be Rico Lewis at 18? I have decided you're going to be a centre midfielder and you're going to be a deep line playmaker. Or is it at 18 you've decided Rico Lewis, you're going to be a right fullback and you are going to be an inverted fullback, as you might see at Manchester City. So at that point, you have got to get the specifics right and focus that player's development so that their last star and a half of ability that comes along is all into their primary position rather than just general development. Because now you've decided what you want this player to be and your development signs a couple of years down the road are going to be a lot clearer. So for that stage, you can start looking at your tactical setup and think, for the long term, Where do I want this player to play? Now, normally, position's not going to vary too much. Rico Lewis is probably quite an extreme example. You might have a player without the midfield ability here, where you've got to choose between a fairly defensive right fullback or a fairly aggressive right wing back. That might be a more realistic option that you get more often. But for Rico Lewis, we've got an extreme example. So now let's go back to our development screen and focus on what we want this player to become. So we've decided that actually Rico Lewis is going to be a centre midfielder for us, and he's going to be a deep line playmaker. So we're going to pick the exact role that fits into our tactic, which here will be a deep line playmaker on defend. And what this point perfectly does is illustrates what could go wrong if you go to the specifics too early. Because let's say in part 1, we'd gone to Rico Lewis at 16 and said, we're going to train you on crossing because 10's a slight weakness for right back. But actually, in centre midfield, it's not going to be hugely important. His crossing opportunities are going to be limited. And now we want to focus on things such as stamina, such as passing range and vision. And that's what we're going to look at now. So we're going to focus on passing, which will improve vision, passing and technique. And you can see probably for his role here, maybe vision is the slight weakness. So that is the one we want to improve the most. So that is where you want to focus on the specifics and say, Rico Lewis, you are going to play this role for my team in the long term. We've decided that this is what you're best suited to, and this is what we're going to work on to get you there as strongly and as much of a specialist in that role as possible. Now, there are some players where you might have a versatile jack of all trades and you don't want to do that. In which case, again, as I mentioned at the start, every player is going to be slightly different. But for the most part at this point, you are choosing between 1 or 2 roles within a position, or when it comes to fullback / wingback, holding mid or centre mid attacking mid, target forward, advance forward. You're choosing between roles. And at this point, it's important you get it right. Now, it doesn't matter if at 18 you're still not entirely sure on a player. Let's say Rico Lewis here. I've not decided if you're going to be a right back or a centre midfielder. Leave it another 6 months. They're still going to develop. They're still going to improve in training, even from the general work, just from playing minutes, just from playing on a training ground. And then 6 months later, you can decide. For this element, I would say the advice is it's better to do it slightly late than never. As long as you don't do it after they've reached their maximum potential, you're ultimately going to get something out of it. How far down their development line they are will determine how much room they've got left to improve, though. Another thing you need to consider when you're working on a specifics, and it's something, again, I've always been incredibly strong on in Football Manager, is mentoring. Because you can get a player's technical ability right, you can get them perfect in the role. If they don't have a great personality, or they don't have a suitable one for your first team squad, you're going to struggle a little bit. So when you've got an example where a player is definitely going to make it at first team level for you, the key things you want are personality and social life. So personality becomes a very important one. For Rico Lewis here, it's perfect. We know it's absolutely fine. Resolute's great. If we can improve it more, then brilliant, but I'm not sure we will. Let's go over to our mentoring groups and have a look at what I'd do. So I always just add a little group here. Let's call it number 1. I just work through 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to look for the senior players with the best personalities, which you can see there's a few pretty strong ones here. Kevin De Bruyne, professional. I always prefer the professional ones to the determined ones. But if you've got a youngster with a balanced personality and you can offer the chance to work with a professional player, of course you're going to do that. In Rico Lewis's case, though, it's a little bit different because he is a player who's already got a very strong personality. So we'll maybe look for someone with a similar one, but a player who is integrated in the core social group. Because when it comes to dynamics, which is one of the biggest moans you see from FM players, the biggest thing is where your social groups line up. Now you can see here, there are 2 pretty influential social groups at the club, but one of them dominates almost all of the key players. Yes, probably Haaland and Foden 2 exceptions, but for the most part, you've got your captain, your vice captain, and quite frankly, the majority of your first 11 in the core social group here. So what we want to do is mold players in. And you can even look at Alvarez there and say, is there a way we could do that? So we would then go to our mentoring groups and we're factoring 2 things, personality and social groups. So let's add a player to it. And of course, at this stage, you will have promoted the player to the first team, so they'll be there. I'm going to use Julian Alvarez as the example here. He's a World Cup winner. He's an influential player. But you can see he's still going to get a little bit of an effect from the group. So if we can get him with senior players, it's not actually about the effect he gets on his game, on his traits, on his personality. it's what he gets out of the social group, because if we can integrate him to the core group as well, then we're going to have a more united team that sticks together, which could be a good thing if you're on a good run. So in this example, we're going to pick our captain out, who is a professional personality, and we're also going to pick another senior player in that position. So we'll go for Rodri on this occasion, and we're going to get them all in there. So you can see that Alvarez will get a light impact from the other two, but what he'll also get is more time spent with the core social group, because he's going to be hanging around with these two more. These two are going to be looking after him more. And you know how it works when you've got a tight-knit team. You've seen it in a Sunday League dressing room, even if you've played at that level. You then get integrated with the people they're friends with in the dressing room, and you become part of the core social group. So it is as easy as that. And it's again a very underestimated value from mentoring, but it is one of the most valuable elements. So yes, in Rico Lewis's case, we probably wouldn't need to do a lot in terms of his personality development. But once I've promoted him to the first team, I'd probably still chuck him in there to become a professional, which he's already got under his belt, but also to make sure he gets in that social group and is integrated with the rest of the squad. Because once he feels like part of the team, he's going to perform a whole lot better. So it sounds obvious, but that is step 4, which is focusing on the specifics for players that are going to either get you a high value if you get them trained into a position as a specialist, or are going to feature in your first team in the future. What applies to all of our youngsters though is the 5th and final big step, which is become more important than ever in FM24, and that is minutes, it's playing time. How do you get the best out of a player? Well, in FM24, at last, it is playing senior football. There were so many years before where it was frustrating that players would develop more from being in your youth setup or develop more from training with you than it would from actually playing senior football at a lower level, which you hear so many players say they were made by going on loan in EFL or non-league or whatever, depending on where they are. So I'm really glad that in FM24, there is a huge weighting towards players developing from playing games, which I would argue is a very realistic change in most cases. So let's head back over to FM. And again, you've got to make your decision here. How strict you want to be will depend on whether the player again is likely to make it for your first team or not. And again, probably at about 18, maybe 19 years of age, I would say is about right. You've got to really start playing senior football. So when Rico Lewis gets to the January window, if we hadn't been able to give him any minutes, but he was still developing well in training, I'd probably be looking to loan him out as an example. So bearing in mind this has now become so much more important in FM24 specifically, we need to be careful when considering first team minutes. Now, you are going to get the odd superstar wonder kid come through, like a Rico Lewis, where you're going to say, actually, he's going to feature in my first team. And at this stage, you'll have promoted him to the senior squad, you'll have trained all the specifics, and you'll be getting him on the bench. Because the thankful thing in most leagues now, even across the EFL and in many other nations as well, like we've seen in Japan in this year's head coach, you get 7 or 9 places on the bench depending what league you're in, and in most of them now you get to make 5 subs, which if you're 3 up or 3 down in a game with an hour gone, it's a great opportunity to throw a youngster on and get them a proper half an hour of development. Chucking them on for 2 or 3 minutes at the end, yes, is a nice touch if you're giving them a debut, for example, but it perhaps isn't going to help their development quite so much, because realistically, they're just going to run for a minute. So in these instances, it's not quite as difficult, because Rico Lewis, you're just promoting and you're making sure they get in the squad. But the one thing I would say at this stage, if you're training them on the specifics, try and get them in a role that's the same or pretty close to that, because they're not going to develop as much if you then play them as a right back again. Or if you're still training them generally, just get them game time, because ultimately they'll improve. You might even find that you need to adjust the specifics again, depending on how they develop in certain other positions, because sometimes needs must at the lower levels with the level of squad you've got and a lack of depth you might have, depending on what your finances are like. But there are going to be a huge other bunch of young players at your squad where they're maybe not quite able to reach the same level. Oscar Bob is another example in FM who's actually featured a lot for City's first team in real life, but in FM, he's maybe not quite so good yet. So I can't see a way in which we get him first team minutes. At the moment, I don't see him breaking through. There's so many strong players in those positions, and he's got a few little weaknesses in his attributes and his personality. Now then, players like this will often, as they are in FM, be loan listed, but you've got to get the best out of them. It may be that you want to say, I just want you to play. Now, for players who you don't feel are going to make the first team, this is absolutely fine. You just want them to play football and you'll go through and select any club that is happy to make them a regular starter. There are some clubs, if you're a bit lower down the food chain, where you might have to worry about wage contribution too, but at times that can come at a cost in terms of player development. When you've got a choice though, like Manchester City have, you want to be particularly specific. So let's say Oscar Bob's got to 19 here and we've decided if you're going to make it for the first team, which I don't know whether you will or not yet, you are going to be an inverted winger off the right hand side, cutting in onto your left foot. In this instance, we would go to the player to loan them out. But instead of just saying, we're going to loan you out and we just want 80% of the wages paid, or we just want you to be a regular starter, I'm going to say, actually, the team you're going to, I need you to be an important player, I need you to be a right winger, and I need you to be an inverted winger specifically. It's something you see the AI doing a lot more in this year's game, and it's something I would recommend you do as well. Now, for Manchester City, for a player on this smaller wage, we're not really that worried about getting it back. So I'd rather have a club that are going to give him all of that rather than a club that perhaps are going to give 100% of the wages and then maybe drop them half the games. So that's what we want to focus on here. Teams that need the player might well actually offer them a bit more. And you can, of course, then if you get 10 or 15 offers, maybe consider breaking down by what the club's training facilities are like and how they might develop there. But overall, game time is the most important in FM24, which at long last, quite frankly. So that's the offer we would make out, and hopefully we get something a bit more specific for the player, rather than just the promise of first team football, which could mean anything. He could be playing left back for all we know if we do that. Now with all of that done, that would normally be the end of my 5-point guide. I'd be saying chuck a thumbs up, see you tomorrow, all of that stuff. But there's been a new trend in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly in the Premier League and particularly due to financial fair play, which may or may not affect you. Now it's something that's happened in the lower leagues for many a year, but often after they've started for the first team. But the trend we're seeing now, of course, in the Premier League, I list examples galore, but let's go for Cole Palmer, who's a very obvious one from City, is selling youth academy stars for pure net profit when it comes to financial fair play. Now, these are players who you've decided perhaps at 20, 21, 22, they're not definitely going to make it, or they are going to make it, but not for a few years, and they may benefit from football to get there. So in this instance, clubs now, instead of sending them out on loan and risking losing them a couple of years down the line, are selling them, but particularly in the big club instances, with buyback clauses. So your decision at the end of the 5 parts, when they've come back from getting minutes on their first loan as an example, is are they ready to be stars and play for your team, or are they ready to sell? So with all of that in mind, let's go over to Football Manager and see how you might structure a deal in that way, because it's something that probably with Cole Palmer, but there are many other examples, happened in real life this summer. So let's go over and have a look at Rico Lewis again. Let's say in a different universe or with a different judgment of a different manager playing in a completely different style, Rico Lewis is a player where you think, do you know what? I'm building a team of really tall, physical, direct players, and having a 5'7" fullback or midfielder, it's just not going to work. So for the next few years, I can't see him being a senior player. I could loan him out 3 times, hope he does well, and then try and sell him at the end. Or what I could do is offer him now, because people pay for potential, and give myself a get-out clause if things go wrong. So let's go to the transfer room and look at what a deal might be structured like. Now, I've got to get the caveat out the way straight away, which is to say, in most of these instances, it's going to be a club approaching you, not you offering a player out. But I'm just doing it so I can show you what a deal might look like. So we saw the player's value is 40 million. You might say, well, now you're going to pay for potential. So I'm going to say to you, you can have a player if you pay 40 million up front for him. Then you're going to add on a variety of clauses. If you play a certain number of league games and international games, goals if it's a striker, etc. I'm only going to do one to show you, but then we might say, well, when you've played 20 league games, 5 million quid, and so on and so forth. You're also going to say, well, this youngster's a brilliant player. If he does reach his potential and sell on, just because he doesn't fit our tactic, he still could be world class. Well, then you're going to offer us a sell on clause, and a healthy one at that. So I want 20 or 25% of what you sell on after that. However, one of the more common trends in these sort of youth sales is the buyback clause, particularly at the upper levels of the game. And that is the get out of jail clause, which is, I might have judged this player wrong. We might be changing managers in 2 years. And if you then turn out to be a superstar after 2 years of first team football at another club and develop really well, we might want you back and we might want first dibs. So in that case, you're going to want a buyback price of, say, £80 million. Say, well, if he does really well, you can have him for now. It is essentially a different version of a loan, isn't it? You can have him for 2 or 3 years. If he goes well, we want him back for double the price. That's going to be the aim of the game. So that's what we're going to do with Rico Lewis. Say that we didn't want him to feature in the first team and we didn't think he was going to make it. It can be a great way to cop out of a decision with some of those youth players you're not sure about. Maybe ones where you can't find them alone, where they're causing a bit of unrest because they want to play. It can be a great way to protect the club, but also help the player develop and maybe become a superstar as well. So that is now sort of the unofficial sixth part of my youth development guide, which I'm trying to adapt to the modern way of the game. And of course, with FFP, that can be a bit of a problem at the top end of the game. But overall, I would say that is a pretty comprehensive guide as to what I do unintentionally in Football Manager. It's something I probably get asked more questions about than most in terms of the comments section, is how I develop younger players when they're signed or when they come through the academy. And particularly in those Build a Nation saves in previous years, these sort of things are quite important. So I try to look after them as best as possible. And it's not a hard and set written guide. It's not a you must follow these tips or your young players are going to fail. But because I've been asked it quite a few times, I thought I'd just run you through the sort of unintentional process I go through in Football Manager. And that is probably as close to it as possible, the steps I go through when developing each youngster at a club. Now, you would worry about a 20-player youth team, but of course you've got to remember, half of those aren't going to be good enough to get through their scholarship and will be released anyway. So you're only talking about the players that are going to sign professional terms. And for those, I would advise following this sort of method, but obviously adapt it per player and adopt your own style to make sure it works for you. But if you did enjoy this episode, my guide to youth development in FM24, then please do put a thumbs up on the video. Let me know in the comments any special steps you take along the way, whether yours is similar to this, more detailed, less details, and do you use the training unit screen? Because there are so few people that use it, I love to know if I'm not the only one. If you want to see how this is applied in saves, then our 2 long-term stories are up in the eye above. The head coach and the save in Southend save will rotate every day through FM24. You can also find links to the Twitch channel and the football podcast up in the eye above too, as well as all the social medias and other stuff in the description below. But thank you very much for watching. Your support is always appreciated. I hope you enjoyed something a little bit different, and I'll see you back here next time as the long-term stories continue.